Recording now. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Blackletter Brunch. My name is Raoul Martinez. In the spring and summer of 2023, the BNF, the National Library of France, held an exposition about the evolution of printing at the François Mitterrand branch in Paris. I saw this last summer of 2023. Most of the images that I'm using in this presentation were downloaded from Gallica, the BNF's digital library, and are being used courtesy of the BNF. My presentation today is an overview of the exhibit and is not exhaustive. For a detailed presentation, for a detailed description, of the exhibit, go to the BNF's website. Which I will put into the chat. It is oh, if I spell this right, I can't cut and paste. Does that link work? Oops, waiting. Oh, sorry, meeting group chat. Hold on. I guess that works. Does that work?
Yes, Raoul. Yes, Raoul, it works.
Okay, good. That works. Okay, great. So, and a catalog of the exhibit in French is also on sale on the BNF's website. Unfortunately, the catalog is not available in English. We'll go back. Here we go. Up. The invention of the printing press in Europe revolutionized the distribution of books and the transfer of knowledge. The BNF's exhibit presented some exceptional pieces, including several copies of the Gutenberg Bible. The BNF owns 2 copies of the Gutenberg Bible, one on paper and one on vellum. Both copies are complete, that is, they include volumes 1 and 2. So this is how a lot of people imagine the invention of movable type, at least in the 18th century. It was a little more complicated than that. This painting is by Jean-Antoine Laurent and is from the Grenoble Library, the Grenoble Museum of Art. It shows Gutenberg sitting at a table cutting a punch, and behind him there are tools of the printing profession, including a small press. There was a lot of research and technological advances involved prior to the actual Bible was printed. So to understand the evolution of printing technology, we have to look back at the printing methods that existed at that time. In Korea, xylography, also known as woodblock printing, had been practiced since the 8th century. Jikji, an anthology of Buddhist teachings in classical Chinese, is in fact the oldest known work produced using movable metal type. It was printed in 1377, 70 years, in fact, before Gutenberg's invention. The second volume of this was on display at the exhibit last year. A later edition was printed entirely from a woodblock without using movable metal type. The BNF acquired this second volume of Jikji in 1952. The first volume, the other volume, is in Korea. Before the development of typography in the mid-15th century, book production went through several phases. In the early Middle Ages, it was confined to the scriptoria of monasteries where manuscripts such as Evangelia were produced. this Carolingian manuscript dates back to the second half of the 9th century. It was made in Saint-Amand-en-Pévèle in northern France. So this is um, a manuscript in Carolingian script, entirely done by hand, of course. This was 9th century. As time went on, in the 12th century, as cities developed, book production migrated from religious institutions toward metropolitan areas. Then in the 13th century, as medieval universities developed, the demand for reading material increased and businesses developed. Bookstores started renting out exemplars of texts to scribes. Exemplars were divided up into péciers, which reduced the output. A pécier is a piece, a partial exemplar of some text, whether it be a religious text, a part of the gospel or whatever. And these were then, they reduced the output and allowed for high quality of copies, for a high quality of copies, and also enabled manuscripts to be produced in series. They could have multiple scribes working on them at the same time. In Paris, sales to non-clerical customers reached a peak in the middle of the 14th century. Booksellers on the Rue Neuve Notre-Dame, on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, were able to offer literary manuscripts in French before they had even received orders for them. One such example is the Roman de la Rose, illuminated by Jeanne de Montbaston, a woman who took over her husband Richard's thriving business. By Gutenberg's time, the book industry was well implanted in cities. It was an urban business now. Its clientele was composed of professionals, lawyers, clergymen, and administrators, as well as a very literate non-clerical public. But in spite of all the measures they used to speed up the production of productions, books were still an expensive commodity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about technological innovations prior to uh, the start of printing. In the Middle Ages, pilgrimages were very popular. These are two medals that were acquired by pilgrims when they went on a pilgrimage to apparently the site of St. Thomas Becket's tomb. Many medals served as pilgrims' souvenirs of their visits to the sites that had sacred relics. The medals were pinned to their garments or hats and then later thrown into the rivers where they were frequently found later on, usually near churches in northern France. Many of these medals were found in the Seine near Notre Dame when it was dredged in the 19th century. Their composition was 60% lead and 40% pewter, whose low melting point enabled them to be mass-produced from the 13th to the 16th century. To make them, they would pour the alloy into a hinged metal mold, a hinged stone mold. It was very dense, hard stone, which had the design engraved inside. Special care had to be taken not to damage the mold because it was used to produce a lot of metals, and these two metals contained holy water from the tomb of St. Thomas Becket and are decorated with scenes from his life. On the left-hand side, you see some, I don't know what these represent, but there are a lot of people on them. I don't know if they had holy water or if they recovered rainwater that had accumulated on the top of his tomb or something or what. I don't know. But these are just two examples of the of things that were found in the Seine. I believe all of these were found in the Seine. They are from the Middle Age, from the medieval museum, the Cluny Museum in Paris. They had an exhibit in the crypt of Notre Dame earlier this year, and they showed a lot of things that they had recovered from the Seine. Uh, World War II bombs, mines, guns, bicycles, things dating from the prehistorical items, as well as lots of these lead pewter medals, lots of them. These two medals depict Saint Leonard in a castle. Can't tell you much more than that about them. As for the molds they use to make these, it is very rare to find any of them intact. Thanks to several literary sources and the fact that molds were found near Mont Saint-Michel, we're pretty sure that most of the medals were made near the holy sites, near the pilgrimage sites. Printing on fabric was done at that time too. Uh, Printing on fabric was practiced in Italy by the 14th century. In 1390, also, relief engraving on wood appeared in southern Germany, and hundreds of images could be printed on paper from a single woodcut. Several conditions contributed to this: growing availability of paper and increasing demand for religious images. Meanwhile, intaglio engraving on copper was perfected around 1440 in the Upper Rhine Valley. This craft, which was closely related to goldsmithing, enabled printers to achieve very fine details. So that was another reproduction method. Using a burin, artists would carve a design into copper, then ink would be spread on the copper, and it would go into the carved marks made by the burin, and then they would wipe off the rest of the ink, and then they would apply paper to it, and that would print the design onto the paper. This print depicts Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. It is a woodblock print on paper. A relief image was carved on a block of wood, and then it would be inked either with a roller or ink balls, and then the paper would be pressed onto it, creating a reproduction of the image in reverse. This particular print is colored by hand after being made. I photographed this myself at the exhibit, but they achieved really beautiful results with the woodblock, with the woodcut. The lines are very sinuous, almost Art Nouveau, although it was made in the early 15th century. This is an example of a woodcut that survived. It is called the Bois Potat. It is from the 15th century and is engraved on both sides. This is considered to be the oldest relief woodcut in Europe. It is either from France or Germany. One side depicts the crucifixion. Although it's partial, you can see in the print that they made from it, this is a modern print made from that by inking this woodcut. You can see the Roman soldiers to the right of Christ, and then you see the left part of the left arm of Christ above them. I'm not sure what the other side depicts. This is another woodblock or another woodcut done by Albrecht Dürer. I believe this is a woodcut from the Apocalypse series from the late 15th century. It is from the Basel Kunstmuseum. The Exercitium super pater noster from the mid-15th century Netherlands um, contains the text of a handwritten prayer in Flemish. Now that's not printed from a woodcut. It is handwritten, and the illustration is a woodblock print. Only one copy of this exists. It's been colored by hand, and there is a second edition that is entirely printed from a woodblock. That is, both the illustration and the text of the second edition is done using a woodblock and is not manuscript. But in this one, the text on the bottom is actually written by hand after the print was done. So it was not uncommon to see combinations of two different technologies. And the name for this is called chirogylography or chirogylography. As for etchings, the seven birds is from a set of 70 playing cards that were intaglio printed from an engraved copper plate. So they date from the mid-15th century and are from the Rhine Valley. There were 70 playing cards like this. So you have two technologies, printing technologies that were already established at that time, woodblock printing and copperplate intaglio or etching. So now we're here, and now we're at the stage of the printing of the Gutenberg Bible. We don't know everything about the Gutenberg Bible. No single document gives us the complete story of how movable type emerged. Nevertheless, several sources point to the Rhine Valley as its birthplace and Johann Gutenberg as the driving force behind it. The oldest typographically printed documents are associated with the city of Mainz, and the Gutenberg Bible is the most well-known of them, both by its scope and its legacy. Now, there were other printed documents prior to this, most of them done in Mainz, and many of them done by Gutenberg and his associates. There were also one-page documents that had been printed prior to that. I haven't included them in this presentation. Gutenberg worked with two men, Peter Schoeffer, who was a future typographic wizard, and the investor Johann Fust. Schoeffer apparently at first was Johann Fust's apprentice, and Johann Fust provided most of the funds for Gutenberg's endeavor. This copy was printed on parchment by Johann Gutenberg and Johann Fust around 1455. It was illuminated in Mainz in Germany around 1455 and possibly later. And the first two lines in the first column are printed in red ink. This practice was eventually abandoned because it was so labor intensive and time consuming that they decided to print only in black. Any red text after that time was manuscript, was entirely written by hand by rubricators and illuminators. The Gutenberg Bible is the first large-scale typographic project in Europe. The first typographically printed version of the Bible and a crucial step in the transmission of knowledge in Europe. Now, although this 643 folio book contains no title page with information about how it was printed, 4 documents from the 15th century indicate that Johann Gutenberg started working on a Bible in Mainz in 1455 with Johann Fust. Now, what documents are those? The first document about Gutenberg's invention is a letter from Inea Silvio Piccolomini, dated March 12th, 1455. We don't have any copy of this, at least I don't have one. Sent to the Cardinal Juan de Carvajal in Rome. The letter, written from Wiener Neustadt in modern-day Austria, tells about an admirable man in Frankfurt on the Main, who showed him dozens of pages from many Bibles which were perfectly legible. So word had already spread in 1455 about Gutenberg's Bible, and it had reached Austria and Italy. The second document that gives us some information about the Bible is dated November 6th, 1455, and it states that Johann Fust loaned Johann Gutenberg a huge amount of money for a book project, including paper, vellum, ink, and other unspecified supplies. This proved that Johann Fust was probably the only investor or the main investor that Gutenberg had. This is another copy of the Gutenberg Bible, another page from the Gutenberg Bible from the National Library of France. You can see the headlines. I believe this says on the top, the book of Leviticus, and there is a large illuminated initial in the second column that was done by hand after the printing was done. The printers left large spaces open for the rubrication and the illuminated initials. They also added red lines in the capital letters. In the third document that I mentioned, Guillaume Fichet, a professor at the Sorbonne, wrote to Robert Gagin in Paris on January 1st, 1471, about a new race of booksellers from Germany inspired by Johann Bonemontano, who is actually Gutenberg, of Mainz, who first invented the art of printing, with which, using metal characters instead of reeds or quills, books are produced rapidly, correctly, and elegantly. And finally, in the Chronicle of Cologne of 1499, below, the printer Ulrich Zell recounts that printing was invented in Mainz by Johann Gutenberg, whose first publication was the Latin Bible, printed with large letters like those used today in missals. And this citation is the oldest known record about Gutenberg printing a Bible. This is a page from the Chronicle of Cologne of 1499. Now, this was almost 45 years after the printing of the first Gutenberg Bible, which was well known by now. This is an excerpt from the last page of a copy of the Gutenberg Bible owned by the National Library of France. This is the paper, one of the paper copies that they have. And there is a note by Vicar Heinrich Kramer of St. Stephen's in Mainz, who says that apparently he was the illuminator. He says that he finished the illumination, rubrics, and binding of the first volume on August 15th, 1456. Another inscription in black below it, partially damaged, dates from 1467 and indicates that the Bible was first used by Berthold de Steiner, vicar in Ostheim near Aschaffenburg. So these documents and these little traces prove that this really is the Gutenberg Bible, which has two columns of 42 lines, each printed using movable type, designed to look like the textura calligraphy used in missals. About 48 of these Bibles have survived today, as well as fragments of some 16 other copies. They found their way to religious institutions throughout the German-speaking world and other countries, although there are no known copies in Italy. Illuminated by hand with ornate letters and rubrics, then bound locally for their owners, their surviving copies often bear signs of having been used in liturgical settings as well as handwritten annotations. So there was a period of experimentation in Mainz that preceded Gutenberg's masterpiece, as well as very polished, more polished pieces produced afterward. One is the red, black, and blue Psalter produced by Johann Fust and Peter Schoeffer, Gutenberg's associates in Mainz in 1457. By this time, at some time after the printing of the Gutenberg Bible, Gutenberg couldn't pay his debts to Fust and had to sell him all his equipment. I'm not sure if Gutenberg actually took part in the production of this Psalter. A Psalter is a book of Psalms, or a book containing some or all of the Psalms from the Old Testament. Another example of post-Gutenberg Bible printing was the Catholicon, printed by Gutenberg and Schoeffer in or after 1460, using solid blocks containing 2 lines of text each. So they had switched their method of printing and actually created 2-line blocks of text, which they then assembled into in a form and then printed from. I guess this was they were experimenting, trying to find easier ways of printing and expediting the process. I'm assuming that the lettering and versals were all done by hand afterward. In spite of the initial secrecy surrounding the invention of printing in the Rhine Valley, the knowledge was spread by German typographers who had been trained in Mainz. Printing presses sprung up in Strasbourg and Bamberg, then down along the Rhine toward Cologne, Eltville, Basel, Nuremberg, and Augsburg. In some cases, the expansion was brought about by scientists or men of the church who actively searched out experienced typographers. One such example was Cardinal Juan de Torquemada of the Benedictine Abbey of Santa Scholastica of Subiaco, near Rome, who recruited Konrad Schweinheim and Arnold Panartz, thus creating the first workshop outside of Germany. Their typefaces were influenced by the calligraphy of Italian humanists who wanted to break away from the thick, broken strokes of blackletter. They printed the opera of the 3rd century Christian scholar Lucius Caecilius Firmianus Lactantius. And you can see that this is a mixture of Latin alphabet, the Latin alphabet and the Greek alphabet. So they had actually, by that time, developed a type in Greek, which was pretty good for that stage. This was just shortly after 1450 or 1455. Venice in the 15th century was a bustling international business mecca and the crossroads between Europe and the Middle East. Frequented by many German businessmen, it had metal foundries and was advantageously located near supplies of paper. The first printer of the city, Jean de Spire, opened the way for typographers, leading to the evolution of the bookmaking industry. Nicholas Jensen from Champagne, an engraver at the Royal Mint, had been sent to Mainz to learn the new technology, and he was one of the first to come to Venice. He quickly formed a partnership with German bankers. So printing had spread to Venice too, and I'm not sure which of them printed this. This may have been printed by Jean de Spire. Um, by the 15th century, Paris was already a major center of book production that catered to the university world and non-clerical clients. The typography got started there thanks to two men, Guillaume Fichet and Jean Hénelin, who were professors in the theology department, who also worked for the Sorbonne. Their aim was to provide cheaper books while reducing errors in texts. Probably while teaching in Basel, Hénelin met Ulrich Gehring, who would soon become one of the three big printers in Paris, with Michael Friburger and Martin Krantz. Fichet and Hénelin got the green light from King Louis the 11th to bring the three printers to Paris, where they then established the first print shop in a spare building at the Sorbonne. In less than 3 years, they cranked out 22 humanist textbooks for the two theologians. And this is a printed edition of Gasparin de Bergame, Bergame's Epistolae, printed by Ulrich Gehring, Martin Krantz, and Michael Friburger in Paris at the Sorbonne. And this was printed in 1470, second half of the 15th century. And you can see that the type is still a little unstable. It's a little wobbly. It's early. This is early printing, but the illuminated border is beautiful. This is Rhetorica, printed by Guillaume Fichet. Excuse me. This is printed by Ulrich Gehring, Krantz, and Friburger in Paris. The text was written by the theologist Guillaume Fichet, who was one of the men who actually brought Gehring, Krantz, and Friburger to Paris from Germany. This was printed in 1471. And again, I believe it was probably printed fairly quickly, but it wasn't a cheap edition, judging from the quality of the illuminated border around the text. Typography had spread to France after 1470. The political borders of the kingdom, as well as the linguistic regions, were different than they are today. Strasbourg was German-speaking. Bruges, associated with the French-speaking court of Burgundy, was one of the first areas to publish in French. Meanwhile, Lyon was known for printing in the vernacular, the French, or the early French. Other French cities ushered in the press between 1475 and 1482. Early print shops, opened in Toulouse, Albi, Vienna, Chablis, Poitiers, Caen, Rouen, etc. Geneva and Chambéry, who were mainly under the influence of Lyon, also printed in French. Nevertheless, this territorial network turned out to be relatively fragile. And some cities which had presses in the early years, like Chablis, Dijon, Albi, etc., who were unable to compete with the larger regional and international centers such as Lyon, Paris, and Venice, eventually lost them sometime before the end of the century, 1500. This is a late 15th century uh, uh, print done by Guy de Roy, Le Doctrinal de Sapienza. And this is printed not in French, but in a regional dialect called Languedocienne, which was spoken in the region of Languedoc, which is in southern France around Avignon, I believe. It was rare to see um, regional dialects in print, very rare. This was published in Chambéry in French, um, printed by Antoine Néret in Chambéry in 1485. The language is French. It's printed in the vernacular, but early French, Renaissance French. Johann Neumeister was an itinerant printer. He was during his career, he printed about 30 works and published in 4 different cities. Originally from Tresa or Mainz in Germany, he may have been associated with Gutenberg. In Foligno, Italy, he partnered with Emiliano Orfini, who was a goldsmith at the mint of the Pope. And with Orfini, he published the first edition of the Divine Comedy of Dante. So this is the first printed uh, piece of Dante's Divine Comedy. Neumeister was imprisoned for debt, and then he surfaced in Mainz, Germany in 1479, and then in Albi in France around 1481. And by 1498, he had to sell all his equipment. And after that, he worked for his former colleagues before just disappearing into obscurity in the late 15th century. This is a replica of Gutenberg's printing press, which was loaned to the BNF by the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. So from the middle of the 15th century until the 19th century, printing presses, mainly made of wood, were used. They made the impression that as they transfer the ink to the media, which was usually paper. The form containing the composed text, which is down here, was placed on a marble slab, and then the marble slab was then placed in the chase, which rested on the bed of the printer, and it could slide back and forth. It could actually slide under the platen. The form was then inked using ink balls made of goose skin filled with horsehair. And while one of the men was preparing the form, the dampened paper or parchment was carefully positioned on the tympan, which is this slanted piece here, using pinholes as reference points, so that the text on the front and the back of the page were aligned. And a hinged frame called the frisket was folded down over it. Now here the frisket is not visible because it's folded down over the tympan. The tympan and frisket were then folded down onto the form, forward like this. The printers then, after which the whole assembly was slid under a heavy platen. The platen is this thing here. I'm not sure if you're able to see my cursor, but this is the platen. By means of a lever called the devil's tail, the platen was then pressed down evenly onto the medium and the inked form. The printers then removed the paper and repeated this process until they had printed the desired number of pages. Two operators shared the work. One of them was in charge of the paper and ink, and the other one operated the press. A lot of trial and error was involved in putting Gutenberg's ideas into practice. Certain procedures were developed, but others must have been adapted from existing technology. Presses for example, were already in use to drain excess water when a paper was being made. We assume that Gutenberg was familiar with paper-making presses. However, to prevent the platen from rotating during the pressing process, Gutenberg had to invent something to attach the platen to the frame of the press, which he did. This rectangular part located in the middle of the press, the till here, is essential to the success of the impression. This is an example of Gutenberg's ability to adapt existing technology to his needs. And this had to be done a lot, I assume, not just by Gutenberg, but by subsequent printers. Gutenberg used large sheets of paper on which he could print 4 pages of text, 2 on each side. The size is called royal, but it was not possible to print 2 pages in a single pass because the platen couldn't exert enough pressure over the entire surface. So the printer had to print page by page. Starting in 1470, a new technology appeared in Rome involving a form with 2 pages. After printing the first page, the chase was pushed to the other side of the bed so that the second page could be positioned under the platen and get printed. I don't have an example of that. The Gutenberg Museum's replica of the printing press was built in 1925. It is probably a little larger than the original. This design had to be based on illustrations and contemporary accounts. No printing press from that time, 15th century or even 16th century, has survived today. There are 2 copies of this press. This printing press was loaned to the National Library of France for the exhibit by the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz, Germany. The Gutenberg Museum has another copy of the same press, which they use daily during demonstrations. There was little or no documentation about the printing practices in the 15th century. They're few and far between. Very little equipment has survived. Researchers have to closely examine details that have survived, including books that have been printed from the 15th century. Some of them show accidents that occurred during the printing process, giving us precious information about the technologies in use. In one case here, a piece of type got stuck to the ink, pulled out of the form, and then fell sideways onto the form, leaving the outline of one of the sides of the sword. This reveals unusual things about the character. Somehow they can tell from this shadow or this trace that the foot of the sword was beveled and had an intentional piercing, but there was no notch by which the typographers could determine the correct position, which was documented by the 16th century. The National Library of France has a set of characters, apparently a full set of sorts discovered around 1868 in the mud of the Saône in the in the Pesquerie district in Lyon. Most of these sorts had rounded Gothic letters similar to those of the Middle Ages. The Pesquerie or Pescherie, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, was the district of goldsmiths and typographers. So this discovery got a lot of attention. Um, the type had the same shape and characteristics as those observed in this print. The beveled foot, the piercing, the lack of a notch. This brought up many questions. Um, how could they print using sorts with beveled feet? Tests show that that wouldn't make printing wouldn't make the composition unstable. And as for the pierced holes, they may have been used to identify, hold together, remove, and ink letters that were printed in red at the beginning of Gutenberg's endeavor. Analysis of the historic and archaeological materials show that these primitive characters had a different form than that of modern type. Um, it shows that the typographic process wasn't normalized. It was very unstable in the second half of the 15th century. Each workshop had to adapt the main attributes of European typography to their own use and leave the rest to experimentation. Women typographers. Printed sources tell us very little about the relationship women had to the workshops. Thus, again, we have to resort to archives to understand the role of women in the world of typography. Their names frequently come up in legal documents that transferred ownership of property when the wives of typographers married or were widowed, for example. This is how we learned what roles women played in their family estates. For example, Paula de Messine, the second wife of Jean de Spire, or Margarita Ugelheimer, the widow of Peter, Nicholas Jensen's investor. They may not have been well versed in typography, but the activity of these women is noteworthy in a professional environment that was in flux. One big roadblock to women was that typography required a skill that few of them had opportunities to acquire in the 15th century. That is, the mastery of Latin, which was taught in universities, but universities were restricted to men only. Some women could overcome that barrier in the family environment. Perrette Bade, the daughter of the humanist typographer Jos Bade, who married in 1526 the Parisian printer Robert Estienne, had the reputation of being a very educated woman. This was mostly based on the observations of her son, Henri de Estienne, who told how all the members of the family could understand and speak Latin, wife and servants included. Nevertheless, he didn't mention how Perrette Bade had been educated. Was it by her father, by osmosis, or nor what role she eventually played in the print shop? One exception was the Dominicans of San Jacopo di Ripoli in Florence, because they proved that women were producing books before 1500. San Jacopo di Ripolo had a workshop operated by nuns under the direction of two brothers who were active, and they were active from about 1477 to 1484. Their output wasn't limited to their own use, to their own needs. They also supplied printed pieces to other workshops. This piece contains a text written by Bartolomeo de la Fonte, who apparently was a partner in their workshop. And that's it. The the This is all I have from the catalog. I wasn't able to actually compile the rest of the catalog, but um, that gives you an idea of what the exhibit was about. Um, did anyone have questions? Um, I don't know if you expected to see more about Gutenberg's Bible or did anyone want to share any pieces that they have done recently? Um, I'm not sure. Yeah, I took about an hour for that. Um,
I don't have anything new, but your lecture reminded me my study 2005. I was studying Gutenberg.
oh,
Yes,
uh,
and made these handouts for my
uh,
small
you-
group. But this one I got from Japanese professor made some ligature. Can you see?
yeah, are those
This is
photos
interesting.
of the Gutenberg Bible?
Yes, and
Uh,
this one DEUS, of course, German people know this part DE put together, and
yeah.
then US put together made this. And when I saw this, they took care of spacing so well, and they made the beautiful texture like this.
Hmm.
Those all strange spacing they fixed with the connecting them each other. That's really
I see.
great thing to learn for me that time.
I see. So that shows how they managed to adjust the spacing of the lines to achieve right justification as well as left justification, I assume.
Um,
I didn't realize, I assumed that they would just use all of the abbreviations that they could possibly use, but this shows that in some cases they would deliberately spell out the letters without using abbreviations in order to fill in
and then must made
read the
many
lines
of,
with full length.
yeah, many of those mobile type. So
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
and the et and the Turonian et, yeah.
I think everybody knows, but um uh, in our city of Torrance has International Printing Museum, and they have those replica of the Gutenberg printer, and people can experience the print with that.
Oh, really? In
Yeah,
Torrance?
in Torrance, and this is the print offset printing, but the actual size of printing we can experience. Maybe not exactly, but yeah,
Mm. No, and is that a replica of one of the pages of the Gutenberg Bible?
I think so. Yes.
Oh, do you know which copy it or like
I
who's
don't.
the owner of that one?
It doesn't have anything, so I don't know. Sorry.
I wonder if that's from the Huntington, because the
Uh,
Huntington Museum
yeah,
has a
we have
copy
it.
of
Yeah.
the Gutenberg Bible.
Uh-huh.
That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And very interesting about the
Um,
about the spacing, the 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 tips, how they managed to adjust the
mhm.
spacing. I didn't know about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Um,
almost 20 years. I should be better now, but
yeah, thank you. Yeah, you could there's a copy of the Gutenberg Bible at the Huntington Museum in San Marino in Southern California. They I don't I'm not sure if they leave it open or if they only I think it's open only one page is I'm not sure if they change pages or
they
periodically.
change, but yeah, we can see only open page.
Yeah, you can see it there. The Library of Congress in Washington has a copy. That's a vellum copy. Um, the BNF has a paper copy and a vellum copy. The Göttingen Library has a vellum copy in Germany, and I believe there's a copy in Japan. There might be several copies in Japan, but Huntington apparently bought his copy during the Depression, I think in the 20s, and he paid like $10,000 for it, and people were scandalized that he would pay that much money during the Depression for a book. And people really hated him for that. So interesting. So, well, thank you very much for joining me today. I just wanted to mention that the Friends of Calligraphy is featuring Risa Gettler in a Visigothic Versals class that's coming up. And if you're interested in signing up for that, there are still spaces left. You can sign up at friendsofcalligraphy.org. That should be a great class. So I will be putting a recording of this online shortly, and I look forward to getting your comments on the